first. All right. So let's talk about, an evaluator for SPDG project. Now, what concepts, strategies, and resources to help you have an impact? All right, this is how we typically introduce ourselves in SIG Network. We choose one of these things. I really would love to hear from somebody if they come up with another idea of how to introduce people that, that folks really like. I'd be interested in that. But just a heads up that we use the 4 H's, to choose their dream or one bucket list item. And the reason that we do that is it just makes it much faster to get to know people. And also just to be more interested in what they're saying, because you know a little bit about them. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself in case you don't know me yet. I'm going to use the 4 H's to give you an example of it. I was a special education teacher, and then I was in the Peace Corps focused on special education in Africa. And then I was a service coordinator in California. That's a social worker for individuals with disabilities. And then I went back to school at University of Oregon, got my PhD in special education, worked at Oregon Department of Ed, and I'd had an internship at the US Department of Ed, and then came into this role. So I've been there for 17 years and I still love it. I have a lot of heroes, as I'm sure all of you do, but one of them is Judy Heumann. She is one of the people who advocated for rights for people with disabilities and was able to get the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. She became the OSER's Assistant Secretary, so Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, which is our umbrella office for OSEP, Assistant Secretary. And then she also got to be at the Academy Awards the year before she died, because she was part of Crip Camp, the movie that the Obamas produced. My heartbreak has been, and this one is pretty much the same every time I introduce myself, the politicization of education, and sometimes seemingly not about kids. And my hope has been, SIG Network has always been my hope, that the SPDGs coming together. It's called SIG Network because it was the state improvement grants once upon a time. Now it's the state personnel development grants. But when I see people working together, and when I see people who have been with SIG Network for a long time, like Tom Manthe and Cheryl Huffman, it's very hopeful, because we continue to be able to improve our work together. So that's me. And in future meetings, like the working groups, etc., I look forward to hearing more about you. So I just want to talk about the SPDG logic model and theory of action, since everything works from there. And then we'll talk about the program measures that are built off of the logic model and theory of action, which you can see is about evidence-based professional development. It's about intervention fidelity, and it's to getting to improve student outcomes. We'll talk a little bit about SIG Network, the resources that we have for you there. And we'll see if you need to know anything about the OSEP side of things. So the SPDG logic model and theory of action, this was created in collaboration with you, whether or not you were there. We worked with the evaluators, we worked with the project personnel, the OSEP side of things to create these a few years back, but I think they still fit. So because this is not a great way to see it, I'm going to go ahead and make it bigger. See if that works. So you don't have to read it. I will read it for you, which means I'm probably gonna have to have my face close to the screen because I have terrible vision. And I'll probably give you the basic idea of some of it, because you'll have it available on a slideshow that I'll share with Kelsey, who will then share with you. So we spend a lot of money in professional development, but we haven't always seen great progress for students with disabilities. And so the big idea of the SPDG is that we have really effective professional development for great evidence-based practices to support the use of those. And that helps teachers to change their practice, which in turn helps kids with disabilities improve. That's the big idea. But the problem behind it all, the problem that we're trying to solve with the SPDG, is that lots of professional development going on, but not a lot of it is very effective and gets change in practice. We want evidence-based professional development, evidence-based practices to be used in the classroom, to be used in the early childhood settings, and for secondary transition. And so, I don't want to take too much time here, but I think it's worth a look at what we're trying to accomplish. But I think even more helpful for the evaluators is this document, which is our theory of action. So the theory of action states that if a SPDG delivers effective and efficient evidence-based professional development practices with fidelity, so which is program measure 1, that's how you do your work, how you do your professional development, including ongoing coaching, which is our program measure 3, for education personnel and families, and develop systems to support those practices, then educators' implementation of the chosen evidence-based practice will increase and be sustained, and families can further support those practices. Then outcomes for children with disabilities will improve, which is our SPDG purpose. All these things being in place are more likely to happen if the SPDG effectively engages state, local, family, university, and community partners in inclusive capacity building. When we do that, then state systems for personnel preparation and professional development will include more effective and efficient teams, data systems, and communication systems. Then initiatives and programs from all tiers of the education system will leverage the state evidence-based professional development infrastructure. So when you wrote your application, these were all the things you had to consider, right? You had to think about what was happening in your state system that supports children with disabilities from birth all the way through secondary transition. That is the scope of the SPDG. And then you had to zero in on some specific needs using your data. But you had to describe how you would use evidence-based professional development, how you would measure fidelity, and the impact you would measure on the outcomes for children. You had to describe how you would work with family engagement partners, how you'd work with university partners, and how you would work with districts or LEAs, as well as other partners that made sense considering what you were zeroing in on. In the end, the SPDG should be changing systems, right? It should be the good professional development practices that you use, such as the ongoing coaching, having the data systems, that should affect other state systems. And then we also want, that infrastructure to stay in place, that sustainability. If you went to the SPDG national meeting, we talked about different ways to measure sustainability. Certainly implementation science that we look at, that we use, should help with sustainability as well. But we want the Great SPDG efforts to affect other efforts so that, when you set up a coaching system, other initiatives in your state can use that coaching system, etc. There's that theory of action. And so I talked a little bit about the evidence-based professional development. And, I talked about earlier the why we think this is important, because we in education, in most fields, but I'll just talk about education, we had missed the how for a long time, right? We had a lot of interventions that worked, but we didn't necessarily have okay, so if we want interventions to be used by teachers, how are we going to support them in that use? And I would say that the PBIS framework was really a great step toward thinking about that how. And then implementation science with the National Implementation Research Network and CSEP, which is the state implementation and scaling up of evidence-based practices TA Center. that they have helped us to move forward on this, the in-between part, the how part. And I just used a case study right here of the Mississippi Miracle. Has everyone heard of, or does everyone know what I'm talking about here when I talk about Mississippi Miracle? Kelsey, will you tell me if there are raised hands, shaking heads, or anything, since I can't see it?
Sure. Yeah, I don't see any. I don't see anything in the chat or any raised hands.
Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm just going to say it just in case. So this is about literacy specifically, but they also had gains in math, and they were gains beyond what would be expected from them. Let's just put it that way to make it easy. So folks were calling it the Mississippi Miracle. The people in Mississippi did not appreciate it being called a miracle. And, you know, you can think about why that might be. If you did really great work in your state and you showed these big improvements and someone said, oh, it's a miracle, you might say, you know what, we actually worked really hard on that. It was in no way a miracle because we planned and we stuck with it and we made this happen. So for Mississippi, it was a 20-year journey. Again, math from 2003 to 2019, they gained 18 points on their NAEP scores, National Assessment of Education Progress. And fourth grade reading gained 20 scale points. And then the George W. Bush Center looked at their systems supports for it and found that if it was white, they did not think that was fully in place, but the other ones they did. So they had good policy, supports, strategic alignment, and sustained commitment. All of these things are really necessary. And I would posit that Mississippi probably had pretty good leadership if they were able to keep going all that time. So I'd have to look at the factors a little bit more closely. But these are the things to consider when it comes to the SPDG. You may or may not have measures of each, but specific measures to them, but they're all part of your evidence-based professional development descriptions. So the things that go into your worksheet about evidence-based professional development, you're talking about all of these things in different sections. A lot of them more in the D and E sections, you know, in the data descriptions, and then more the systems interventions. But these are all things that need to be happening if you're going to get to the outcomes you want and if it's going to sustain. So looking at Mississippi's success and a little bit more about what they have to say about it, they said it's a long-term commitment to increasing standards and aligning testing and accountability systems. So this is big scale thinking, but I think the reason I think it's important for the SPDG and for evaluators is you've got to look at, does everything match up? What with the early intervention system or the district, the school that you're working with, is everything matching up so that the intervention you're using actually makes sense in the system? And then they talked about their comprehensive professional development that was focused on high quality evidence-based instructional materials. So there's a good data backing for this. There's some really significant research from Heather Hill and others who study professional development that if you do training and coaching and use your data system to support personnel in using evidence-based instructional materials, you're more likely to see the impact you want from your professional development. And what I come away with from reading the research, you know, we know that we need good professional development, right? That you have to use the engaged training that focuses on a skill, that you have a measure of the impact of the training and how the training was done. And then you connect it to the coaching and you have that coaching, that you have observations to see, say, what a teacher is using, if they're using the effective practices. And then you look at it on an ongoing basis, and then you look at the impact on kids. But here is that next level, not just the comprehensive professional development, but what are you giving teachers and other personnel to use? What evidence-based instructional materials? So it's just some food for thought as you're working with your project. Hiring decisions I won't get into because I think that doesn't affect you all quite as much. But thinking about Mississippi's deep implementation requirements a little bit more, they worked with some great advisors. Many of you have advisory boards of some sense who give you feedback. You share data about what you're doing. They give you great feedback about it, and they help give you a sense. You can't have every perspective, and a good use of an advisory board, sharing your on the ground data about fidelity, about your evidence-based professional development, what you're seeing on the child outcomes is going to help them be much better advisors. So I think that's an important thing for evaluators to be considering. We talked about, the folks who work with the kids need to have intentional training. They need to know exactly what they're supposed to do and be able to use materials to help them do it. This is another partner. We were talking about the university partner, the family, the parent center partner, the district partner. All those partners should help you do your work more deeply. If you do that, have those partnerships that really work to each other's strengths. And then the expert coaches. And what Mississippi had coaches that were in a system controlled by the state, typically a SPDG does as well, and giving those coaches the training and coaching they need to be very effective. And you may or may not have measures of that in your APR. You're certainly going to have coaching measures. You may or may not have measures of whether the coaches are being trained and coached well, but it is something you might include. And here's that high quality instructional materials. So how do you know if they're using appropriate materials? If it's something in reading and math, how can you ensure it has, an evidence base behind that material? So this gets into the implementation science idea. So the evidence-based professional development, the rubric and worksheet is based on implementation science, and it's really quite a bit based on the implementation drivers. But this gives you a sense of why it's so important to have that how or the implementation science, because every SPDG, when you put together your application, the top one that talks about your plan is what you think it's going to be like or what you hope it's going to be like. And if you've been around a little while, you know that the reality is certainly most like the bottom one. And that rainstorm and the clouds is maybe when the governor changes. You've got the trees, maybe a school decides that they can't stick with you anymore because they've had leadership changes. The budget's not going, the budget office isn't giving you the numbers you want. All of those are realities of the SPDG, and we get that, and your project officer wants to hear about it. And you as for the project personnel here, for the evaluators, you all are often what's a good way to put it? You're the steady aspect of the grant. So many things might happen with the team at the state level, and you are there even when changes take place. You can say, this is what we've been doing. Here are the data that we have available to look at and think about. Have you asked these questions? And that's why I always say you all are so important to this SPDG, that when the project personnel hit these realities, you can help them to keep on going. And I know at least one person here who is new to the SPDG, but is already playing that role in a state. We appreciate you. Measuring sustainability, I think, is really important. How do you know, say if you're working with districts, how do you know that they'll be able to continue supporting your practice once the SPDG is over? So how are you going to measure sustainability? Is it something you want an actual measure for in your APR? And these are the different ways you can look at sustainability, shared vision, what's the accountability, relationship problem solving, resource sharing. And then you look at teams and capacity and leaders and champions. All right, so your SPDG that you support, the question for you that you can add an answer in the chat, or you can just answer in your head. When you look at this level of the system and contextual focus. So this image over here, I'm going to explain it a little bit to you. This was from Steve Goodman in Michigan and Kent McIntosh at University of Oregon, the PBIS, one of the PBIS project directors. So it's called the Framework for Addressing Practice and Supports. And what it shows is at the different levels of the system in your state, and this is a K through 12, this is K through 12 language, but you can think about it for early intervention as well. So if you are at the classroom level, at the grade level, the overall grades in the school, district, region, or state, the amount of focus you give to educational practices versus supporting the infrastructure. So the SPDG at the state level thinks a lot about supporting infrastructure. So you think about the implementation teams that need to be in place, the communication, the data systems, supporting administrators, making sure policy supports all the work. You're thinking more about that. And as you get closer to the classroom, you think more and more about the educational practices. And so the state level thinks about what they need to give to the classroom that support those educational practices. And it's important that you have observation in order to know what the classroom needs, and that your data also tells you what's working and not working, maybe from your coaches, maybe there are other ways to do it, but you've got to know what it looks like to implement those educational practices in the classroom in order to build the correct infrastructure up here. And the evaluation data will help you to do that. And again, it's going to look different what you expect to see at the district level, to the school level, to the classroom level. Questions about that? Okay. And were there any questions that have come up previously that I didn't get a chance to answer? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. All right, so we've talked about evidence-based professional development as part of implementation science overall. And I think I may have spoken about this already a little bit. But when you think about the theory of action, if we go back to the SPDG theory of action, this is what we've talked about so far. This is that effective and efficient evidence-based professional development. So you're doing good training, you're doing good coaching, got data that shows you that you're doing good, active, engaged training and coaching that is really matched to the needs of the personnel. If you got all that in place, then you expect personnel to use the evidence-based practice and in an improving way over time, right? So say you are implementing MTSS. You are going to measure MTSS maybe on a school level, on a district level, but the fidelity measure that you're going to capture is going to be, what is MTSS supporting in the classroom? So is it supporting reading? Is it supporting something with behavior, math, etc.? What do you expect? Again, I'm using K-12 language, but I could use early intervention language as well. What do you expect teachers to do that's going to improve results for children with disabilities? And that's the fidelity measure that you capture here. It used to be a little more flexible, a little more open, and we weren't seeing the impacts on children with disabilities that we were hoping for. And so now we're being very specific that the fidelity measure is something that's going to change child outcomes, something specific that's going to reach them. Again, it could be reading, it could be math, it could be behavior, it could be secondary transition, using high leverage practices, the HLPs, but it needs to be something that really reaches the child. So not so much an implementation team and what they're planning for MTSS, although that's important. That's not what we are measuring for program measure 2 anymore. Questions about that?
I have a question.
Sure.
Um, so, um, like if one of my districts is focusing on improving their RTI system across all
Mhm.
schools because they notice that kids with RTI plans in elementary, those don't follow them to middle school, and if they have one in middle school, it doesn't follow them to high school, and so they're losing supports. Is
Mhm.
tracking an improvement in those supports continuing along, does that count as a student level measure, or is that still a systems level measure if students are continuing to receive the supports that they need without having to start over?
The specific to the IEP, what the IEP says the supports need to be?
Well,
Is
the
that your?
RTI, so RTI, prior to needing an IEP, like they've got this
Yeah.
intervention plan, yeah.
Yeah, I would say so. So response to intervention, like MTSS, which I think they're generally interchangeable, but I'd be interested to see if you thought there were some differences. So RTI is ensuring that children get the supports they need, right? And when we're looking at how a child is doing in a classroom, it's typically specific to math, reading, behavior, maybe science, etc.
Okay.
And so it's still in the end, the processes of RTI are in service to the instruction the child receives and or the interventions they receive.
So would it
Yeah.
be okay to say that students are meeting their benchmark, like their goals on their plans? Because if they're measuring, is our RTI system effective? Each kid is going to have different goals. So it's not like we're looking at only reading in our district. We're looking at the kids who need those extra supports. Are they making progress towards those goals? So could it be like a goal of, our students are meeting their RTI goals?
Yeah.
That
That
is
would be
a measure.
the child outcome.
Yeah, so
So,
that would count.
yeah, that'd be the child outcome, but
Okay.
the fidelity measure would be about the intervention or instruction received as a result of the RTA processes.
Perfect. Okay, that's what I was thinking too, but I wanted
Yeah.
to check. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for asking, Rebecca. Good to see you. All right. Other questions that have come up for people so far? All right, so let's take a look. When it comes to intervention fidelity, one of the things I promised you at the outset was giving you the why is this important? Why have we changed intervention fidelity? And I talked about it a little bit already. So the studies that when we first created program measure 2, which is about improving fidelity, we base that on studies that say you can't expect to reach the outcome unless you're doing the thing with fidelity, right? Whatever, you have to use evidence-based practices, which means there's a research base to it. And it's an evidence-based practice because the research said someone used it like this, and then we got this child outcome. So that's part of the reason, that's part of the explanation of fidelity. And then we've had more studies since we originally created the GEPRA and the program measures that says, you really have to have some fidelity to get to those child outcomes. The reason we changed intervention fidelity is because seemingly from what we're seeing from research and then from the SPDG experience is it's not enough just to have say good MTSS processes in place. It seems like we actually have to be on the ground looking at the instruction interventions the child is receiving in order to make a real impact. Again, part of this is research, part of this is just SPDG experience, what we see in APRs. And so, we actually use your APR data. We use what you learn to look across the program and say, okay, what do we need to change? And so that was one of the changes that we used from your data was we need to know what's going on in the classroom or what's going on, for the individual child in early intervention. And we're not getting to that level if we're just looking at the district implementation team or just looking at the school implementation team. That's important. We need those things in place. We need those things to be working, but we have to know what's going on at the personnel to child level, what happens in between them. Is it a little tricky sometimes? Yes, it is. Is it very tricky sometimes? Yes. And luckily we are not research typically. Typically you don't have an IRB agreement. You don't have that level of expectation that say IES would have for you. It is program evaluation, right? So we get to play in the sandbox a whole lot more than we would if we were a research program and these were research projects. So we're painting broad stroke pictures of what works, what doesn't work, what we see. But when I get to look across 35 projects each year, it gives me a sense of what works and what doesn't work. And my sense is that we need on the ground data of what is happening for those children, what works and what doesn't work for the teachers and other personnel. So that's why we changed the intervention fidelity measure. It's still messy. We're still playing with it. We're still figuring it all out, especially with those MTSS or RTI or PBIS of what it looks like to get to the intervention level. What other questions do you have and what didn't I explain fully there? Okay. So let's take a look at an exemplar, and some of you already saw a bit of Maine's report last time, so I apologize. So Maine, this is an exemplar report from a little, I think a year or two ago, and I need to update it. So they have, in this section, they have all their program measures and they have a few project measures. So here's their evidence-based professional development measure. And I'm going to get into intervention fidelity right now, but hopefully we'll have time to go back to that. So for program measure 2, this is, and program measure 2 about intervention fidelity, you get to create your own target. You get to determine the tool you're going to use to assess fidelity, etc. This is your measure. And of course, it's agreed upon with your project officer. So the way that they state it, within 2 years of implementation, 80% of Math for Maine teachers will implement Math for Maine practices with 70% fidelity as measured by the Math for Maine fidelity of practice tool. So it's at the teacher level. They know what their tool is going to be. They know they have a percentage of fidelity. And, you know, for the most part, when you're first starting out, you don't really know what you can expect. You don't, unless you have been doing work like this and, you know, prior to having this grant, you've been doing this specific work. It's hard to say what you can expect. And so in future years, you might need to shift your targets a little bit, but this is certainly what they were hoping for. But I don't think with Math for Maine, I don't know what they based on, if they had anything. With PBIS, it's a different story. It's a, you know, nationally, it's been used for years. It's on a big scale. So you can use national numbers. You could potentially use state numbers to determine what you would expect to see with fidelity when you're doing your professional development. But I think Math for Maine would be different because they're kind of developing it as they go. So this is their target. They didn't have actual data to show you on this, but it's a well-described measure. I like that the components that they have in the measure. But it's interesting, if you look at PBIS, they're looking at tier 1 PBIS, which reaches the child, but you could see it, it's like a little bit broader than an intervention or instruction per se. Yeah, so that's again, that's when it gets a little like, is this really gonna exactly what we were asking for? I think it's an ongoing discussion. So any other thoughts about intervention fidelity, expectations, and what it might look like? Okay. So let's go ahead and look. And I had this open on the previous session, and let's see. If you just look up Active Implementation Hub, that's how I always do it, even though I'm their project officer. It's fast. So this is CSEP's website. National Implementation Research Network is their umbrella organization. And if you want to get into fidelity, they have many, many resources, tools, modules, lessons. And so you can see here, effective practice, effective implementation, enabling context, socially significant outcomes. This gets at shaping the evidence-based practice and making sure you know what you want to see with the fidelity measure. If it's something that's been around for a long time, like PBIS, you might not need to do as much work on it, but Math for Maine was newer. They were shaping as they go. This would be great for Math for Maine. So they have the things that describe the usable innovations. And then I'm not going to go into the hexagon tool. It's a great tool, but just won't be time probably today. So the usable innovations and overview, even if you have gotten off the ground, you're in your, you've already gotten your grant funded, you can still go back and say, do we know everything we need to know about this intervention that we're focused on? And so this can get into defining those things. So I highly recommend going to the Active Implementation Hub and just playing around. And they have, what you can read, watch, listen, reflect on, and apply, which I think is a great way of doing it. All right. So going to SIG Network, promise that we would get back into the evidence-based professional development. So at signetwork.org, if you go to the grants and APR tab and go down to APR and program measures, and you can see got a nice menu up here. I will have the informational webinar about APRs. It's coming up, I think, Kelsey, you said January 24th, I believe.
Correct. Yeah, on the 24th.
Thanks. And so we'll update all this information with the new Dear Colleague letter, which hopefully you've received. If you haven't, if you could put your email address into the chat right now. It's the letter that comes from Larry Wexler. It comes through our G5 system. You get it electronically, and it says, this is when your APR is due, and gives you an overview of the instructions, etc. Okay, so on the APR page, the program measures for the SPDGs, we have program measure 1, which we're going to get into now, evidence-based professional development. We just talked about program measure 2, improving implementation. And then program measure 3, ongoing TA, we can talk about, and 4 is student outcomes. So this provides guidance for each. For evidence-based professional development, this is the only one where we set the target. OSEP sets the target for you. And we say, if you have been implementing your project for 2 years, you should be at 50% of the components rated a 3 or 4. If you've been at 3 years, this is your target, 4 or 5, etc. So here's where it's set. And we've had this forever. It should not say draft anymore. Okay, Kelsey, will you remind me? I got to fix that. So you can see we set the targets for you here. This document needs an update. And then it shows in the status chart what it might look like for you to describe it. So it's basically giving you a template. So by the end of the second year of RTI implementation, 50% of professional development components will have a score of 3 or 4. It's measured against the rubric of professional development components. And then this is your target. And this is the ratio. It doesn't come out as exactly 50%. And then explanation of progress at the bottom. It's just the beginning of a description. You're going to have your worksheet attached to your APR, but this is just a summary of what received a 3 or a 4. So these are all components that we're doing well on. And these are the things we want to focus on in the coming year. And then you'll also have a chance here to say any help you need from OSAP. Like, do you want a special training session on how to use your data system or how to support administrators, etc.? You can ask that here. So that gives you the basic idea, but sometimes I think it's more helpful to look at the sample APRs and Math for Maine. Here's their program measure 1. You can see their target. And of course, they have 2 program measure 1s because they have 2 initiatives. So Math for Maine and PBIS. Also look at on this page. Oh, let's see, I'll bring this up. On that APR page, we also have Idaho as an exemplar. And South Dakota. And we'll have more this year. You know, we'll look at APRs and we'll come up with some more. All right, I'm going to come back to this because it's taking a second to load. So that's guidance for program measure 1. And down here, if the grantee started in 2015, 16, 17, this is what they would use. But I think all of you pretty much should have started after 2020. And so there's the revised rubric and worksheet. The rubric provides the components that you'll respond to in the worksheet, but also gives examples of what a description might look like that would receive a score of 4, which is the best score. So here's the component over here. The domain is selection, and this matches with the implementation drivers. So selection is about how you choose the professional development participants and also the trainers and coaches. And so the required elements are over here. And then this is a description, just a sample description of what it could look like if you were adding all the detail needed to score a 4, which is the exemplary level of progress, or to the description. A 3, appropriate level of, detail in the description, basically. A 2 and a 1, which is minimum or minimal. So you can go through and just take a look to give you ideas, or you can look at the exemplars. This is a little chart that they made. And see how they described their different elements. Even if they're working on something different than you are, it still may give you some ideas to take a look at this, especially if you're new to SPDG. The big idea is sticking with these. So the required elements, we've gone ahead and made them bullets over here, at least the highlight of it. So expectations for a PD participant, what a schools, districts, and other entities agreed to provide, just really sticking to answering that specific expectation or requirement. Because it doesn't need to be an extremely long description, it just needs to respond to that. It may be helpful to have a somewhat novice person read your descriptions to see if they have questions, if it all makes sense to them, if you have the ability to do it. I am also very happy to match states. If you want another state to read yours and give you feedback, and they would like feedback as well, we can just pass those between the two of you, or the two states. So that is an example and the rubric, and then the worksheet itself is right here. And it just gives you the space to respond to, oops, it gives you the space to respond to it. And also it gives you a place to assess yourself. And we have a contractor who's going to look over your APR, your GEPRA measures or program measures in your APR and in the worksheet. And it doesn't matter what you assess yourself for their measure, but they will include it in their Excel spreadsheet that they put together of all of your self-assessments and then their assessments of whether it's scored a 1, 2, 3, or 4. So here again, you can see this is the worksheet. So you have a place to put quotations there, your self-assessment score here. And there's 16 components. Any questions about evidence-based professional development, the aspect of it? Okay. Going back to the APR page. So that was program measure 1. We talked about program measure 2. Program measure 3 is ongoing technical assistance. So this is our cost measure. And if we look back at mains and we look at, there you go. So you can see they labeled it as program. You could say GEPRA 2. I would take that GEPRA GPRA, which is Government Performance Results Act. Either one is fine. Program is preferred, if you could remember to do that. The other kind of measure is the project measure. And so these are just measures that you created because they're appropriate for your work. And you can blend them together in the status chart. Have a project measure and a program measure as long as they all line up with the objective for that specific section. So by the second year of implementation, at least 70% of SPDG Math for Main funds will be used on sustained professional learning activities. So the big idea of program measure 3 is you have trainings where you expect the personnel, say a teacher, to learn one or more new skills, and you measure whether they gain those new skills. You look and see, perhaps you have an observation of how the training is done. Is it active? Lots of people use the high quality professional development observation checklist, which is really helpful to know if training is being done well. And then you provide the data you have about the skills that the personnel learned to your coaches so that they can go out and work with folks. You also use the data about the skills folks picked up to feed back to your trainers and to say, hey, trainer, they didn't seem to pick up on this aspect of the skill. Maybe that's something you could focus on a little bit more next time. Or maybe you have the participants' reviews of the training that said, no, I didn't really feel actively engaged. I didn't feel like I mastered this aspect. And maybe you feed that back into the trainer, that back to the trainer. So program measure 3 is about how much you spend on that initial training. And then it's about how much you spend on the coaching and gathering fidelity data and using the fidelity data to improve it. So all the things that come after the initial training, we want to see what percentage of funds you use on those activities that lead to full implementation and lead to sustained implementation. So they're saying 70% of their professional development budget for Math for Maine will be used specifically for coaching and those other things that help with deep and sustained implementation. And then these are the dollar amounts. So this numerator is how much was spent on coaching and like activities. And the denominator is the overall professional development funds spent. And so they actually spent 91% on that coaching and deep supports. So any questions about the cost measure so far? I'm going to show you the guidance document too. All right. So when we first created this cost measure, the story behind it was the draft measure that Larry Wexler was the program lead before me. The draft measure that he had created was about how many people are reached with training. So how many people participate in SPDG trainings. And we wanted to get, as we were learning things from National Implementation Research Network and Learning Forward, which was the National Council on Staff Development at the time. When we were learning things, we were thinking, we need to do, and Joyce and Showers, etc. We were learning, we need to do deep implementation, which means we need to go a little further than just a workshop or a training. We want something that's going to change practice. And we're starting to learn what that looked like. And so here you'll see that's why we had the ongoing technical assistance, the coaching, mentoring, that kind of thing, because we wanted to say, this is really important too. Initial training is great. Workshops can be great, but only if the teachers are supported after the workshop so that they can actually get it into practice and it makes a real impact. Each grantee gets to set their own target for this measure. And if it turns out your target really is not realistic, either it's too easy to meet or too hard to meet, you can talk to your project officer about changing it for the next year. And then it gives you an image of what it looks like. Again, the target can be just a percentage. Here it's a dollar amount, but can be just a percentage since you don't know exactly how much you expect to spend. But the actual performance data needs to be dollar amounts. And then you can provide the percentage to the right of that. Explanation of progress, example. Any questions about program measure 3? All right. So program measure 4 for the main project. So again, they have math for main and the PBIS. So their statewide assessment is the NWEA map. And the population they're looking at is children with IEPs in 4th and 8th grade. And so they're trying to decrease the gap, and that's their child outcome measure. You report the child outcome measures each year of the grant that you have the data, but our contractors who look at our data that we then use for GEPRA to share with Congress, they are not going to be reporting it to Congress until the final years of your grant, the last year and maybe a no-cost extension year if you have it. So 5th year and a no-cost extension year. So we do want to see your data because we're going to learn from it as we go along, but it won't be used formally as a GEPRA measure to share with Congress until the last year. So you can see Maine didn't have those data yet, so they have 999. And they hadn't determined their target yet. I think they were going to look at the data to determine what the baseline was. They could determine their target. It's overall a good measure. Statewide assessment can be tricky because it changes, it seems to be changing a lot, and may not be well aligned. We talked about with Mississippi that you need to have the standards aligned with the instruction, aligned with the assessments. So you just have to make sure that all maps out if you're going to use the statewide assessment. For PBIS, this is kind of interesting for those of you who know PBIS. They're using the Student Climate Survey, and they want a score of 75% or higher. Again, PBIS has been in place longer in Maine. The math for Maine, they're still building. And so they expect a target of 80% of the schools to meet that. And then they do not yet have the data for that, but as soon as they do, they will add to that section. But when you don't have the data, you just use the 999. So we have 1 minute for questions. I am going to have that informational webinar that's coming up on January 24th is what we were saying. I'll look at that in the background. So I will talk about a lot of these things again, but if you get together specific questions for me or just conceptual things that you want me to get into, please share those so that I can make it a little bit more interesting and don't just have to say the same things. Yep, it's going to be January 24th from 3 to 4 Eastern. And Kelsey will be sending out the formal invites for that, for the APR webinar. Yep, and the video recording will be shared with the slides. You can share it with whoever you want. It's publicly available. All right, well, it's great to see you all. And then Kelsey, thanks for putting this together. Thanks for those of you who stayed with me for 2 hours. Hopefully some of it was interesting. And I'll see you all soon.